Thank you, Steve. It's nice to be here today. Thank you all for joining me today. My name is Chad Carlock. I'm an attorney who's been working with families and service providers in the developmental disabilities area for over 25 years. And I want to talk to you today about the history of the Lanterman Act and why California's legislation, the Lanterman Act, and the entitlement that was created by the Lanterman Act are so important, have been so important in the development of the service industry in California, and why it's so important, and why the knowledge of where it came from and how it came to be the way it is important for us to protect the entitlement in the future. I want to start by going back to the beginning of the service system in California. For a long time, there was no service system in California. Families were basically on their own. Communities were on their own. Some communities, some families started banding together to create their own resources, sort of from the ground up. That's where the ARC came from. Groups of families getting together to provide support to each other and to create programs and services for their family members. That's where basically the impetus for the special education system in California education came from, was a parent up, grassroots type of thing. But in terms of state provided services and facilities, until really the 50s and 60s, the only thing that was available was the state hospitals, as they were originally called, which were large institutional segregated facilities where people with disabilities were cared for, but were essentially warehoused and were cut off from the greater community and given the services and supports that they needed to stay alive, but not to thrive. So the state hospitals were really the only option for families in terms of public supports during the first part of the 20th century, for sure, and until the rise of the community-based service system that was created by the Lanterman Act. So before that, essentially the only options were staying at home with your family members and having family members or community or siblings care for people with disabilities, or shipping them off to the state hospitals. They were few and far between, so oftentimes this was a long trip and was very isolating for the rest of the family. If they had a person with a disabilities that was sent to an institution, they may or may not have ever even seen that person again, in fact. So many families and parents got together and started networking, as I said, in the late 40s, 50s, and into the 60s to form these collective organizations like the ARC, like other service provider organizations that eventually developed later on, and other advocacy organizations, including consumer-led advocacy organizations that developed over time. But originally, the idea for this was for parents to work together and strategize and get grassroots support for alternatives to these state-run, state-operated institutions. This was happening all across the country. So it was happening here in California, it was happening in other states, and it was happening at the federal level. In the early 60s, the Kennedy administration, in fact, started taking a look at services and what has been available and what should be available to people with disabilities and their families. So there was a presidential panel that was convened in 1961, provided a report and recommendations to the federal government in 1963. So it developed some new legal resources and legal mechanisms for additional services and supports to be provided at the federal level. President Kennedy, in fact, in October 24th of 1963, addressed the National Convention of the ARC and talked about the development of additional services and supports and the community-based services and supports. At the same time, 1963 in California, there were 13,500 individuals who were residing in the state institutions at that time. And there were 4,000 more who were on the waiting list to get in to the state hospitals, as they were still called at that point. There was some family involvement in the institutions. And in fact, the Fairview State Hospital was visited by some parents and community advocates, and they brought along an investigative reporter with them to take a look at what the conditions were and what kind of services were being provided in the state hospitals. The reporter reported in their series of scathing articles that it was the worst conditions they have ever seen in a facility, in a series of reports that they did. The San Francisco Chronicle also did a investigative series looking at the state hospitals, including the Sonoma State Hospital at that time, which was a series of large, even in 1963, aging and old warehouse, type facilities. They brought in an expert in the field from Denmark who viewed the Sonoma State Hospital, and he said, in our country, we would not treat cattle like these people are being treated in the Sonoma State Hospital. So the advocates visited. There was some public attention and bad press, of course, for the state as a result of these two investigative journalism series. And there was some heat on the state legislature. What should be done about the state hospitals, the condition of the state hospitals, the fact that there was a wait list to get into the state hospitals, and what sorts of services were being provided. At this time in the early 60s, Governor Pat Brown, father of Governor Jerry Brown, was governor of California at the time. And so he went to the legislature for answers, asked them to study the situation and propose solutions. What should the state do about this situation? The State Department that was overseeing the state hospitals at that point was still called the Department of Mental Hygiene. So they did an internal study and proposed to the legislature that the solution to the state hospital problem was to build more state hospitals. They also decided they should be rebranded the developmental centers to sort of modernize the language a little bit, at least. But their solution was, well, let's build more so we can have modern facilities and get people off the wait list and continue to provide services in these state institutions for more people with developmental disabilities. And some of the legislators pushed back on that, including Frank Lanterman and his two co-sponsors of what became the Lanterman Act. They posed the novel question of maybe we should ask what the parents want in terms of services going forward. Parents answered, the ARC and other advocacy groups went to these hearings and testified, and that they said they wanted a life with value for their loved ones. Not a warehouse, not an institution, not a segregated setting, but a new model, the community-based model. So the legislature decided that this new model was worth trying out. And in 1966, legislation was passed that created two pilot programs for the first two, what became known as regional centers. So this is before the Lanterman Act, in fact, came in. It was, as I said, two pilot programs, regional to San Francisco and Los Angeles. The idea at that point was that those two pilot programs would review the waiting lists, take a look at who was on them, what their needs were, and develop some alternatives to assist families at home while they were waiting to get into the institutions. What other services could be provided? Initially, these services were mostly medical supports, physical therapy for those with physical disabilities, and hope that eventually there will be space for your loved one in an institution. The parents continued to network. They were forming their own groups. They were advocating, and they were, again, looking for a different model. They started their own schools, private schools, outside of the public school system, and they also advocated for and eventually were able to get the adoption of the special ed program across the state. Now, after these two pilot programs were developed and in the running for a few years, eventually these pilot programs and a lot of advocacy by parents and parental groups and advocacy groups and self-advocates resulted in the signing of the Lanterman Act. The Lanterman Act was enacted in 1969. Fun story, a little background on the actual creation of the Lanterman Act. Mr. Lanterman had developed the legislation, working with families and developing this wider model for how are we going to expand services across the state outside of the developmental centers, and even as an alternative to the developmental centers, working closely with parents. But it was an uphill battle in the legislature. And there was a lot of times when it looked like the Lanterman Act might fall by the wayside or get delayed or watered down or not passed at all. And there's a famous story about a group of parents, I think it was mostly mothers, but a group of parents who followed Mr. Lanterman across the street from the state capitol to the Senator Hotel, where many legislators lived during the legislative season, and literally cornered him in an elevator and talked to him about the needs of their families and the importance of these reforms that were being proposed in what became the Lanterman Act. As a direct result of this parental advocacy, he became the champion of the Lanterman Act. That's how it ended up with his name. And he ensured that the needs of these families were not going to be overlooked and that the legislation would, in fact, be passed. The Lanterman Act was signed into law in 1969 by, at the time, California Governor Ronald Reagan. And so Senator Short and Lanterman and several other legislators were key to making sure that this act got passed. It expanded the regional center system statewide. That continued to develop over time, but it established a framework for services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There was a major revision of the 1969 Act in 1973 that expanded it even further. The 1973 legislation created eligibility categories, not just mental retardation, but autism, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, and what's become known as the fifth category, which is other neurologically handicapping conditions that are similar to those other categories. So it greatly expanded the scope of eligibility for services, and it also created in 1977, in another amendment expanding on the scope of the Lanterman Act, it created the Department of Developmental Services as its own distinct entity, a state agency created to oversee the operations and the funding of all the regional centers and the developmental centers. Over time, the regional center system has grown from the original 2 pilot programs in San Francisco and Los Angeles to the current 21 regional centers set up all over the state. Because of population, primarily, 8 of those 21 are located inside Los Angeles County. So the other 13 cover the rest of the state. The Bay Area has 7 regional centers, and then there are some rural areas where multiple counties, I think up to 10 counties up in the northeast corner of the state, are all covered by one regional center. So the idea was that they would all be roughly equivalent in population. Once upon a time, that was true, but the system of regional centers has not changed. It has not continued to expand. It's sort of locked in right now at 21. So there are some real differences in populations that are served by each regional center. Obviously, there are also geographic differences. In regional centers, like Central Valley or Kern Regional Center or Inland Regional Center, and Far Northern Regional Center up in the far north, as it goes by its name, there are additional challenges that come from just the geographic spread of the regional center. There are transportation issues that come in, and the availability of programs varies widely from one regional center to the next. In a small urban regional center, you may have to go, 10 miles to reach your nearest program, whereas in the high desert, it might be 100 miles that you have to travel to get to a program that can meet your needs. So there are geographic issues and other issues between the different regional centers. But the idea is, and the purpose behind the regional center system is that ideally you have a localized authority that can respond to those localized needs and can adapt to them and help develop programs and help consumers and families find programs within their geographic area that can meet their needs. Now, these regional centers were established as local nonprofit agencies. They're not government agencies most of the time. They end up performing sort of quasi-government functions because they are the conduits between the state of California and the funding sources and the service providers and families on the other end of the system. They're operated and overseen by community-based boards of directors. The idea originally was one regional center per million population, but now, as I just mentioned, we have 21 regional centers and approaching 50 million people in the state of California. I haven't heard anybody advocating or clamoring for getting us up to 50 regional centers anytime soon. So I think we're stuck with the 21 probably for the foreseeable future. But one of the things that we're going to talk about later is that that could always be changed by the legislature. They could add regional centers. They could take away regional centers. They could do away with the regional centers and directly administer the programs. So, just because it's in the Lanterman Act now doesn't mean it always will be. Each regional center has a contract with the Department of Developmental Services. They have performance goals that they're supposed to meet. They have data reporting that they have to send back to the department. And if the regional center is not performing their obligations, the Department of Developmental Services can step in and either operate the regional center directly or terminate that contract and contract with a new board to run a new regional center for the same area. Regional centers' responsibilities generally are for intake, new consumers coming into the system, making sure they're eligible, managing their cases, meaning conducting the IPP meetings, making sure that the client's needs are assessed and that there's a determination made as to what services will meet those needs, and then finding the vendors and contracting with the vendors who are going to provide those services. They also then oversee quality assurance to make sure that the service providers that are contracted with are actually meeting the consumer's needs and helping them to survive and thrive, hopefully, in the community. So the regional center system developed, throughout the 70s as a result of the Lanterman Act being enacted in 1969 and revised throughout the 70s and 75 and again in 77. The next big milestone in the development of the Lanterman Act came from the 1982 state recession in California. There was an economic downturn throughout the country and especially in California in 1982. The state government had an $11 million deficit. Now, that in today's budgets, that's a rounding error. But in 1982, that was real money. And this was statewide, not just the developmental services budget, but the entire state budget had an $11 million deficit that they were looking to close. One of the ways in which they sought to close that budget deficit was ordering cuts to the DDS budget. Now that cut to the DDS budget was unallocated, so it was up to the department to figure out where to get the money from. The Department of Developmental Services issued a set of spending priorities to the regional center. Now, priorities was a euphemism for limits. And what it in fact did was directed the regional centers, in order to save money, you're only permitted to purchase for your consumers a place to live, a day program, and whatever else you need to ensure their basic health and safety. No bells or whistles, no frills, no additional services, no additional supports beyond those three categories. And a group of families through the Arc of California sued the state to stop these funding priorities from going into effect. That lawsuit was filed in 1982 by a group of families, and again, led by the Arc of California. Eventually, that litigation made its way all the way to the California Supreme Court. The trial court in that case in 1982 ruled in favor of the parents and issued an injunction to stop those spending priorities from going into effect. So the state appealed that decision, and the Court of Appeals also ruled in favor of the parents and left the injunction in place. So the state appealed again to the California Supreme Court. That's why it took 3 years for the case being filed in 1982 to making it to the California Supreme Court in 1985. It ended up being a unanimous decision by the California Supreme Court, and they affirmed the vote below. They agreed again and affirmed the lower court's decision granting injunctive relief and prohibiting the state from implementing those spending priorities. Now, so this 1985 Supreme Court case really is the most important case in terms of the entitlement, at least, in the history of the interpretation of the Lanterman Act, and not just because they ruled in favor of the parents, but because of what the court said in doing so. It was, as I said, a unanimous 7-0 verdict in favor of the parents. And the court held for the first time that what the Lanterman Act had done in 1969 was created an entitlement, a statutory entitlement for all people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in California to receive the services that they need and to receive those services at the state's expense. So this was, it's been called sometimes the creation of the entitlement, but that is a bit of a misnomer because that assumes that the entitlement did not exist before 1985. And that's not what the California Supreme Court said. What they said was that although it had never been recognized as such before, the entitlements started in 1969 with the passage of the Lanterman Act. And that, in fact, when the legislature said that the state of California assumes an obligation for our citizens with intellectual and developmental disabilities, which we must follow, that's what they meant. The entitlement really is an entitlement. The driver of the system, the determination of the scope of the entitlement, is not the amount of funding that is allocated by the state. It's the individual consumer's IPP, their individual program plan. If you aggregate all of those together, whatever is required to provide those services, that is what the entitlement requires. One of the things that the department had argued in that case was that A, there's no entitlement, and B, if there is an entitlement, the scope of the entitlement should be limited to the amount of money that we allocate to carry it out. And once we run out of money, that's the end of the entitlement. And the California Supreme Court said, no, the entitlement is the entitlement, and the state is obligated to provide services for everyone with an IPP to the greatest extent possible. We'll talk about in a minute what happens when the money runs out. What they said the department could not do was to alter the scope of the entitlement, to narrow or reduce the entitlement by issuing administrative priorities or by saying you can only spend money on X and Y and not Z. Those sorts of things the court called categorical reductions. And basically they're saying, but you're administratively changing the law without actually changing the law. So what the Supreme Court held was the only way to change the law is for the legislature to actually change the law, to change the scope of the entitlement, to say that specifically the entitlement allows for these types of services and not other types of services. But that's not what the Lanterman Act says. And so the Supreme Court said that's not what you can do by limiting your funding or limiting the categories of services that can be provided. And I'm going to give you a couple quotes just to underscore how revolutionary this was, how important it was, and how important it still is in the scope of services today and looking at what the scope of services is going to look like in the future. In talking about the entitlement, the California Supreme Court said, quote, "The Act clearly defines the right of the developmentally disabled person to be provided with services and the corresponding obligation of the state to provide them." In talking about the IPP process, the court said it is through the IPP procedure that the right the Act grants to each developmentally disabled person and the obligation it imposes on the state are implemented. So the content of the entitlement really is an individual right of each person with a developmental disability to receive the services that they need as defined by their IPP document. That's why it's so important to make sure that all the needs, all the wants, all the goals, all the objectives, and all the services that an individual wants and needs are contained within that document. The court talked about the role of the regional centers in implementing the entitlement. And the court said, while it is true that the regional centers have wide discretion in determining how to implement the IPP, they have no discretion at all in determining whether to implement it. They must do so. So this means that the regional center is obligated contractually and through the entitlement to provide all the services that are set forth in that IPP document. Now, how those services are provided is a matter for their expertise, their advice to the consumer and family about what services are available, what providers are available, and how those needs can be met. But they have to work with the family and the individual in making decisions and making choices about how to deliver those services and how best to meet those needs. They do not have the discretion to not meet a need that is set forth in the IPP. The state does not have the ability to define the substance of what can and can't, should and shouldn't be in those IPPs. That's a matter for the planning team to decide. Now, the court did say when the money runs out, the department obviously cannot continue to fund services, indefinitely beyond what's allocated to them. But what the court said the department needs to do is to go back to the legislature. And the remedy is with the legislature. The department has an obligation to report back to the legislature. We are not able to meet all of our consumers' needs under the entitlement because we have not been granted enough resources. Then the critical decision has to be made by the legislature. Do they allocate more funds so that the entitlement can be fully realized? Or do they legislatively change the scope of the entitlement to reduce the amount of services that are being provided? They can only do so by changing the Lanterman Act. And one could argue that that's in fact what has happened over the last 20 years. There's been a series of rate freezes. There's been a series of changes made to the Lanterman Act that you could argue are in fact legislative changes that chip away at that entitlement. Things like recreation and camp services that were not available for quite an extended period of time because the legislature made changes to the Lanterman Act. Rate caps, rate freezes that prevented consumers from receiving the services that they need, that prevented providers from being able to attract and retain qualified staff and adequate staff to cover their needs and to meet the ratios and objectives that they're required to and that they needed to provide good services. So it's very important as advocates, as family members, as consumers, that we pay attention to what's going on every year in Sacramento, what the contents are of those budget trailer bills that make substantive changes to the Lanterman Act. That is the only way, according to the Supreme Court's decision, that the entitlement can be changed, altered, reduced, enlarged, or done away with completely. So when those changes are made, we need to be paying attention. We need to know that they're coming so that we can tell the legislature what sorts of impacts those changes are going to have. And if those changes are made either over our objection or without us noticing, we have to go back and hold them accountable and say, these are the changes you made last year. This is what's happened to my family member as a result. This is what's happened to the day program that my family member went to for 20 years and is closing their doors. So these things are important. They matter. That's why it's important to pay attention to what's going on in Sacramento. And if we want to preserve and protect the entitlement and even enlarge the scope of the entitlement, the only way to do that is through the legislature. So we have to make sure that we understand what's going on, that the legislature understand what's going on, and that parents and advocates and family members and consumers continue to have a voice in the process of recognizing, celebrating, and protecting and maintaining that entitlement. If you want to learn more about how the IPP process works, watch the next video. And I thank you for your time.